The desert wind carried more than dust that October morning. It carried the scent of change, though Marcus Thompson couldn't have known it as he stood on the porch of his weathered ranch house, watching his 8-year-old daughter Emma chase their old dog Rusty around the yard. The New Mexico landscape stretched endlessly before them, painted in shades of amber and rust, a canvas of solitude that had become both his sanctuary and his prison. Marcus had been alone for 3 years now, ever since Sarah's battle with cancer had ended on a cold February night. The ranch that once echoed with laughter and the warmth of a complete family now felt hollow, despite Emma's bright presence. He'd thrown himself into the work, mending fences, tending cattle, and trying to fill the silence that seemed to grow louder with each passing season. Emma had adapted better than he had, in some ways. Children possessed a resilience that amazed him daily. She still asked about her mother, still kept Sarah's photograph on her nightstand, but she learned to find joy in small things. The way morning light filtered through their kitchen window, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, the sight of roadrunners darting between the mesquite bushes. "Daddy, can we ride out to the old creek today?" Emma called, her pigtails bouncing as she ran toward him. "I want to see if there are any new wildflowers." Marcus smiled, the expression coming easier now than it had in those first dark months. "After we check on the south pasture, sweetheart. Old Blue's been acting up, and I want to make sure the fence is holding." The morning routine was familiar and comforting. They loaded into his battered pickup truck, Emma chattering about her upcoming school project on desert animals, while Marcus navigated the dirt roads that crisscrossed his property. The ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, and he knew every rock, every gully, every stand of cottonwoods that marked the seasonal streams. It was near the boundary fence that separated his land from the Runaway Apache reservation that he first saw her. At first glance, he thought it might be a mirage. The desert played tricks on the eyes, especially in the shifting light of late morning. But as he slowed the truck and squinted through the dusty windshield, the figure became unmistakably real. A woman sat beneath the sparse shade of a desert willow, her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders, her clothes dusty and worn. Even from a distance, Marcus could see she was in distress. Her shoulders shook with what appeared to be silent sobs, and she clutched a small bundle to her chest. "Daddy, is that lady okay?" Emma asked, pressing her face to the passenger window. Marcus felt his protective instincts surge, both for Emma and for the stranger who seemed so vulnerable in the vast emptiness. He'd been raised to help those in need, a value his father had instilled in him through example rather than words. But he also knew the complexities that existed between his world and the reservation. There were unspoken boundaries, cultural differences that ran deeper than property lines. "Stay in the truck, Em," he said gently, parking about 20 yards from the woman. "Let me see what's going on." As he approached, the woman looked up, and Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. Her eyes were the deep brown of river stones, lined with exhaustion and pain, but there was strength there too, a fierce determination that reminded him of the desert itself, beautiful and unforgiving in equal measure. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with high cheekbones and skin bronzed by the southwestern sun. The bundle in her arms moved slightly, and Marcus realized she was holding a baby. "Ma'am," he said softly, removing his hat in a gesture of respect his grandfather had taught him. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The woman studied him with wary eyes, as if measuring his intentions. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse, probably from crying and the dry desert air. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to trespass on your land. I needed to rest." "You're not trespassing," Marcus assured her. "This old fence line's been here so long. Half the time, I'm not sure which side belongs to who." He gestured toward his truck where Emma waited patiently. "I've got water, and my daughter's got some snacks if you're hungry. You look like you've been walking for a while." The woman's gaze shifted to the truck, and Marcus saw her expression soften slightly at the sight of Emma. "I don't want to be any trouble." "No trouble at all." Marcus kept his voice gentle, sensing her fragility. "I'm Marcus Thompson. This is my ranch." "Maria," she said after a moment's hesitation. "Maria Santos." Marcus nodded, recognizing the surname as common among the Apache families. "Well, Maria, why don't you let me give you a ride somewhere? The sun's getting high, and it's no weather to be walking with a baby." Maria looked down at the infant in her arms, and Marcus saw her resolve waver. The baby, he couldn't tell if it was a boy or a girl from this distance, appeared to be sleeping, but even from where he stood, he could see the child was very young, probably only a few months old. "I don't have anywhere to go," Maria admitted, and the words seemed to cost her something. "My husband, he's gone, and his family, they don't want me around anymore." The pain in her voice was raw and immediate, and Marcus felt an unexpected surge of empathy. He knew something about loss, about feeling adrift in a world that suddenly seemed foreign and hostile. "Gone. Killed in a car accident 2 months ago." Maria's voice was barely above a whisper. Tommy was coming back from work in Ruidoso. The roads were wet, and she couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus felt his throat tighten. 2 months. The grief was still fresh, still sharp enough to cut. "I'm sorry for your loss." Maria nodded, then continued as if she needed to get the words out before she lost the courage. "Tommy's mother, she blames me. Says if I hadn't been pregnant, he wouldn't have been working so much overtime. Says if I hadn't married him, he'd still be alive." Her voice cracked. "Yesterday, she told me to pack my things and leave. Said the baby and I weren't welcome in her home anymore." The cruelty of it struck Marcus like a physical blow. To lose a husband and then to be cast out by his family, left alone with an infant, it was a level of abandonment that made his own loneliness seem almost selfish by comparison. "Where did you plan to go?" he asked gently. Maria shrugged, a gesture that spoke of exhaustion and desperation. "My own family lives in Phoenix, but we don't speak anymore. They didn't approve of Tommy, didn't approve of me marrying outside the tribe. I haven't talked to them in over 2 years." Marcus glanced back at Emma, who was still waiting patiently in the truck, then made a decision that surprised him with its swiftness. "Look, Maria, I've got a guest room in my house. It's not fancy, but it's got a bed and running water, and you're welcome to stay until you figure out what comes next." Maria stared at him, as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "You don't even know me." "No," Marcus admitted, "but I know what it's like to feel lost, and no mother should have to sleep in the desert with her baby." For a long moment, Maria said nothing. Marcus could see her weighing her options, her pride warring with her desperation. Finally, she looked down at the sleeping infant, and then back at him. "Why would you help us?" she asked. "We're strangers." Marcus considered the question. Why was he offering? Part of it was simple human decency, the same impulse that would make him stop for a stranded motorist or help a neighbor with a fallen tree. But there was something else, something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the recognition of grief in her eyes, the understanding that came from having walked through his own valley of shadows. "Because sometimes strangers are just friends we haven't met yet," he said, repeating something Sarah used to say. "And because my daughter's watching, and I want her to see that we help people when they need it." Maria's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Marcus thought she might refuse. Then she nodded, a small, hesitant movement. "Just for a night or two, until I can figure out what to do." "Of course," Marcus said, though something in his chest hoped it might be longer. "Let me help you to the truck." As they walked toward the vehicle, Maria clutching her baby and a small cloth bag that seemed to contain all her worldly possessions, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, a sense of purpose beyond his own grief. Emma rolled down the window as they approached, her curious eyes taking in the situation with the quick understanding of children. "Emma, this is Maria and her baby," Marcus said. "They're going to stay with us for a while." Emma smiled, the bright, uncomplicated expression of a child who hadn't yet learned to be suspicious of strangers. Maria, is your baby a boy or a girl?" "A girl," Maria said, her voice softening as she looked at Emma. "Her name is Isabella." "That's a pretty name," Emma said solemnly. "I bet she's hungry." "Babies are always hungry, right, Daddy?" Marcus chuckled, the sound surprising him. What was the last time he'd laughed, even quietly? "That's right, Em. Why don't you scoot over so Maria can sit in the middle?" The drive back to the ranch house was quiet except for Emma's gentle chatter about the animals they passed and her observations about the landscape. Maria listened politely but said little, her attention focused on the baby in her arms. Marcus found himself stealing glances at her in the rearview mirror, struck by the contradiction she presented. Vulnerable yet strong, defeated yet somehow unbroken. The house looked different as they pulled up the circular drive. Marcus saw it through Maria's eyes. The weatherwood siding that needed a fresh coat of paint, the porch that sagged slightly on the left side, the flower beds that Sarah had planted and he'd struggled to maintain. It wasn't impressive, but it was home, and it was solid and safe. It's not much, Marcus said as they climbed the front steps, but the roof doesn't leak, and the hot water usually works. It's beautiful, Maria said quietly, and Marcus could tell she meant it. After sleeping rough in the desert, even his humble ranch house probably looked like a palace. Inside, the house still bore traces of Sarah's touch. The quilt she'd made draped over the sofa, the photographs arranged on the mantelpiece, the kitchen curtains she'd sewn from fabric she'd found at a craft fair in Santa Fe. Marcus felt a pang of guilt, as if he were somehow betraying Sarah's memory by bringing another woman into their home. But then Isabella stirred and made a small sound, and he remembered that this was about helping someone in need, not replacing what he'd lost. The guest room's down the hall, Marcus said, leading Maria toward the back of the house. There's a bathroom right across the hall, and the kitchen's always open if you need anything. The guest room was simple, a double bed with one of Sarah's quilts, a small dresser, and a window that looked out on the garden. Marcus had used it for storage in recent years, and he'd hastily cleared it out that morning while Maria waited in the truck with Emma. "This is more than enough," Maria said, settling onto the edge of the bed with obvious relief. "Thank you, Marcus. You have no idea what this means." "Don't mention it," Marcus said, though he was beginning to understand that he might have gotten more out of the arrangement than she had. For the first time in 3 years, the house didn't feel quite so empty. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, Marcus watched Emma help Maria feed Isabella small spoonfuls of mashed vegetables. The scene felt both foreign and familiar, as if his home were remembering how to be inhabited by more than just grief and loneliness. "Tell me about Tommy," Marcus said gently, sensing that Maria needed to talk about her husband. Maria's eyes brightened for the first time since he'd found her. "He was funny," she said. "Always making jokes, always trying to make people laugh. He worked construction, but he wanted to be a teacher someday. He was taking classes at the community college when..." She trailed off but then continued. "He would have loved Isabella so much." "I'm sure he did love her," Marcus said. "And I'm sure he loved you." Maria nodded, tears threatening again. "His mother says I trapped him, that he only married me because I got pregnant. But that's not true. He proposed before he even knew about Isabella. He said he wanted to build a life with me, wanted to show me the world beyond a reservation." Marcus felt a surge of anger toward Tommy's mother, toward anyone who would add to Maria's pain during such a difficult time. "People say cruel things when they're grieving," he said carefully. "It doesn't make them true." "I know," Maria said, "but it still hurts." After dinner, Marcus found himself sitting on the front porch while Maria put Isabella down for the night in the guest room. Emma had gone to bed an hour earlier, and the house had settled into its familiar evening quiet. But tonight, the silence felt different, not empty but full of possibility. When Maria emerged from the house, she paused at the screen door as if uncertain whether she should join him. Marcus gestured to the chair beside him, and she settled into it with a soft sigh. "Emma's a wonderful little girl," Maria said. "You're raising her well." "I'm trying," Marcus replied. "Some days I feel like I'm just making it up as I go along." "That's what parenting is, I think," Maria said, "making it up and hoping for the best." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the gentle lowing of cattle settling for the night. The stars were brilliant in the clear sky, unmarred by city lights, and Marcus found himself remembering nights when he and Sarah had sat in these same chairs, planning their future and dreaming of the family they would build together. "Your wife," Maria said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "Emma talks about her. She sounds like she was special." "She was," Marcus said simply. "Cancer took her 3 years ago. Some days it feels like yesterday, other days like a lifetime." "I'm sorry," Maria said. "That must be incredibly hard." Marcus nodded, surprised by how natural it felt to talk about Sarah with this woman he'd known for less than 12 hours. "The hardest part is feeling like I'm failing Emma. She needs a mother, and I don't know how to be both parents." "You're not failing her," Maria said with quiet conviction. "I can see how much she loves you, how secure she feels with you. That's not the look of a child who's being failed." Her words settled something inside Marcus that he hadn't realized was restless. "Thank you for saying that." "It's true," Maria said. "I lost my own father when I was Emma's age. My mother did her best, but She was so consumed with her own grief that sometimes I felt invisible. Emma doesn't have that look. She knows she's loved. As the night deepened, they continued to talk about their childhoods, their losses, their hopes for their daughters' futures. Marcus found himself drawn to Maria's quiet strength, her ability to find hope even in the darkest circumstances. She spoke of Tommy with love, but without bitterness toward fate, and of Isabella with a fierce protectiveness that reminded him of his own feelings for Emma. When they finally went inside, Marcus felt as if something fundamental had shifted in his world. The house no longer felt like a monument to loss, but like a home with the potential for new beginnings. As he lay in bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar but comforting sounds of a baby sleeping in the next room, he allowed himself to wonder if perhaps the desert wind had brought him exactly what he needed, even if he hadn't known he needed it. Outside his window, the stars continued their eternal dance, and somewhere in the darkness, the desert held its secrets close, knowing that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as emergencies, and that healing often begins with the simple act of opening one's door to a stranger in need. The second week of Maria's stay brought an unexpected rhythm to the Thompson household. Marcus found himself waking earlier, not from the restless sleep that had plagued him since Sarah's death, but from a sense of anticipation he couldn't quite name. The sounds of Isabella's morning babbling and Maria's gentle singing drifted through the walls, creating a soundtrack of life that the house hadn't heard in years. Emma had taken to mothering both Isabella and Maria with the earnest intensity that only children possessed. She would carefully arrange her dolls around Isabella during tummy time, explaining in serious whispers how important it was for babies to exercise their muscles. When Maria looked tired, which was often in those early days, Emma would bring her glasses of water and offer to read her picture books, her small voice stumbling over the bigger words but never giving up. She reminds me of myself at that age, Maria told Marcus one morning as they watched Emma demonstrate the proper way to burp a baby using her favorite stuffed elephant. Always trying to take care of everyone else. Marcus smiled, recognizing the truth in that observation. Sarah used to say Emma was born with an old soul. Sometimes I think she understands things that adults miss. It was during that second week that Marcus began to notice the small ways Maria was making herself useful around the ranch. He'd never asked her to help, had insisted, in fact, that she was a guest and should focus on recovering from her ordeal. But Maria seemed unable to remain idle. She started small, washing dishes after meals and tidying the living room while Isabella napped. Then he noticed his laundry had been folded and put away, and the kitchen curtains had been taken down, washed, and rehung with a crispness they hadn't possessed in months. "You don't have to do this," Marcus said one afternoon, finding Maria in the garden, carefully weeding around Sarah's struggling roses. Isabella lay on a blanket nearby, gurgling contentedly at the play of shadows through the cottonwood leaves. Maria looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of her gloved hand. "I know I don't have to. I want to. It makes me feel useful, less like I'm just taking up space." "You're not taking up space," Marcus said, settling onto the ground beside Isabella, who immediately reached for his finger with surprising strength. "You're helping Emma learn about kindness. You're bringing life back to this place." Maria paused in her weeding, studying his face with those perceptive dark eyes. "You sound surprised by that." Marcus considered her words. "I guess I am. I'd gotten used to the quiet. Thought it was what I wanted. And now?" He looked around the garden, noting how much brighter it seemed with Maria working in it, how Isabella's laughter seemed to make the flowers stand a little taller. "Now I'm remembering the difference between quiet and empty." That afternoon, while Emma was at school and Isabella napped in the guest room, Marcus found Maria on the front porch, staring out at the vast expanse of desert with an expression he couldn't read. Her hands were busy with some kind of needlework, and as he drew closer, he saw she was embroidering tiny flowers onto a piece of white cotton. "That's beautiful," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "What is it?" "A dress for Isabella," Maria replied, holding up the small garment. "My grandmother taught me to embroider when I was Emma's age. She said every child should have something made with love to wear on special occasions." Marcus examined the intricate work, impressed by the delicate stitches and the way the flowers seemed to bloom across the fabric. "You're very talented," Maria smiled, the expression transforming her face from merely pretty to genuinely radiant. "It's something to do with my hands while I think. And lately I've been doing a lot of thinking about what comes next, among other things. Maria set the dress aside and turned to face him more directly. Marcus, I need to tell you something. I've been calling around, trying to find work, maybe a place to live. But every time I start to make plans to leave, something inside me resists. Marcus felt his chest tighten. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd grown accustomed to Maria's presence in ways that surprised him. The house felt more like a home with her in it, and Emma had blossomed under the attention of another maternal figure. But more than that, he found himself looking forward to their evening conversations on the porch, to the way Maria listened when he talked about the ranch or his concerns about Emma, to the way she laughed at his awkward attempts at humor. You don't have to rush into anything, he said carefully. You and Isabella are welcome here as long as you need to be. That's just it, Maria said, her voice soft but intense. I'm starting to need to be here, and that scares me. Marcus understood exactly what she meant. The connection growing between them felt both natural and dangerous, like a desert storm that brought life-giving rain, but also the potential for flash floods that could wash away everything familiar. Why does it scare you? He asked. Maria was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the embroidered flowers on Isabella's dress. Because I love my husband, really loved him, and I feel guilty that I can sit here with you and feel. She paused, searching for words. Feel happy. Feel hopeful. Feel like maybe the world isn't as dark as it seemed 2 weeks ago. Feeling hopeful isn't a betrayal, Marcus said gently. Tommy would want you to be happy. I know that in my head, Maria replied, but my heart is still catching up. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed and Isabella was settled for the night, Marcus found himself sharing things with Maria that he hadn't spoken about since Sarah's death. He told her about the nights he'd spent walking the ranch, trying to exhaust himself enough to sleep without dreams. He described the weight of being solely responsible for Emma's happiness, the fear that he was somehow failing her by not being enough. He talked about the loneliness that had become so familiar he'd almost stopped noticing it. Grief is strange, Maria said when he'd finished. It changes shape, but it never really goes away. I used to think that meant I'd never be happy again. But watching Emma with Isabella, seeing how your face changes when you laugh, I'm starting to think maybe grief just makes room for other things without disappearing entirely. Is that what you want? Marcus asked. For it to make room for other things? Maria met his eyes directly, and in that moment, Marcus saw not just the pain she carried, but the courage it took to even consider opening her heart again. I think I do, she said, but it's terrifying. The breakthrough came during the 3rd week, in the form of a crisis that neither of them had anticipated. Marcus had ridden out early to check on a section of fence that the cattle had been testing, leaving Emma at school and trusting Maria to handle the morning routine at the ranch. He was examining a post that had worked loose in the recent winds when he heard the sound of an engine approaching too fast on the dirt road that led to his house. By the time he'd ridden back, he found Maria standing on the porch with Isabella in her arms, facing down a woman he didn't recognize, a severe-faced Apache woman in her 50s, flanked by 2 younger men who looked angry and uncomfortable. Marcus Thompson, the woman said as he dismounted, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I am Margaret Santos. This woman is my daughter-in-law, and she has stolen my son's child. Marcus felt his protective instincts surge, the same fierce protectiveness he'd felt when Emma had been bullied at school the previous year. He moved to stand beside Maria, close enough that she could feel his support without him crowding her. Mrs. Santos, he said politely, his voice carefully controlled. Maria isn't stealing anything. She's caring for her daughter. That baby belongs with family, Margaret Santos replied, her eyes never leaving Isabella. Not with strangers who don't understand our ways. I am her family, Maria said, her voice stronger than Marcus had heard it since that first day in the desert. I'm her mother. You're an outsider who seduced my son away from his people, Margaret shot back. Tommy would still be alive if he hadn't gotten mixed up with you. Marcus saw Maria flinch as if she'd been struck, and he felt anger rise in his chest like a flash flood. That's enough, he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority he used when disciplining unruly cattle. You're on my property, and you'll speak respectfully or you'll leave. Margaret Santos turned her attention to him, her eyes filled with contempt. This doesn't concern you, white man. This is tribal business. It concerns me when someone threatens a guest in my home, Marcus replied steadily. And Maria is here by choice. She's free to leave anytime she wants, and she's free to stay as long as she needs. Maria, one of the younger men, said, his voice gentler than his mother's. Come home. We can work things out. Marcus recognized him as probably Tommy's brother. There was a resemblance in the shape of his face and the set of his shoulders. But there was also something calculating in his eyes that Marcus didn't trust. What changed your mind, David? Maria asked quietly. 3 weeks ago, you stood by while your mother threw us out. What's different now? David shifted uncomfortably. We've been thinking about Isabella. She should know her heritage, should grow up knowing her father's family. And my heritage doesn't matter? Maria asked. My family's traditions don't count. Your family turned their backs on you. Margaret Santos said harshly. At least we're offering to take you back. Marcus saw the pain flash across Maria's face, and he stepped closer to her. Maria doesn't need to be taken back anywhere. She's not property. Stay out of this, Margaret warned. You don't understand what's at stake here. I understand plenty, Marcus replied. I understand that Maria has been through enough without having to defend her right to make her own choices. The confrontation might have escalated further, but Isabella chose that moment to start crying, not the gentle fussing she usually did when she was hungry or tired, but the sharp, distressed wail of a baby who could sense the tension around her. Maria immediately began to soothe her, rocking gently and murmuring soft words in what Marcus recognized as Apache. The sound seemed to deflate some of the anger from the group on his porch. Margaret Santos's face softened slightly as she watched Maria comfort the baby, and Marcus caught a glimpse of a grieving grandmother behind the harsh exterior. She looks like Tommy, David said quietly. She does, Maria agreed, her voice thick with emotion. She has his eyes. For a moment, the space between them filled with shared grief rather than anger. Marcus could see the love and loss on all their faces, could understand how Tommy's death had torn this family apart in ways that went beyond Maria's exile. Mrs. Santos, he said more gently, would you like to come inside? Have some coffee? Maybe hold Isabella for a while. Margaret Santos looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected such an offer from the man she'd just been threatening. You would do that? After what I said? Isabella is your granddaughter, Marcus replied, and grief makes people say things they don't mean. The next hour was awkward, but necessary. Margaret Santos sat in Marcus's kitchen, holding Isabella with the careful reverence of a woman who had thought she might never have this chance again. David and his companion, introduced as Tommy's cousin Robert, accepted coffee and made stilted conversation about the drought and the price of cattle. Maria remained tense throughout the visit, clearly waiting for the other shoe to drop. Marcus stayed close, ready to intervene if the situation turned ugly again, but also trying to give the family space to navigate their complicated feelings. It was Emma's return from school that ultimately shifted the dynamic. She burst through the front door with her usual energy, chattering about her day until she noticed the strangers in their kitchen. With the unerring instinct of children for reading social situations, she immediately moved to Maria's side. Is everything okay? She asked, her young voice serious with concern. Everything's fine, sweetheart, Marcus assured her. These are Isabella's relatives. They came to visit. Emma studied the scene with thoughtful eyes, taking in Margaret Santos holding Isabella, Maria's tense posture, and the general atmosphere of unresolved conflict. Then, with the kind of diplomatic wisdom that amazed Marcus, she approached Margaret Santos. You must be Isabella's grandmother, she said politely. I'm Emma. I've been helping take care of Isabella while Maria gets better. Margaret Santos looked down at the blonde, blue-eyed child with curiosity rather than hostility. Have you now? Yes, ma'am, Emma replied seriously. She's a very good baby. She hardly ever cries, and she's already trying to sit up by herself. Maria says she's going to be strong like her daddy. The mention of Tommy seemed to break something open in Margaret Santos. Tears filled her eyes, and she pulled Isabella closer. He was strong, she whispered. Even as a little boy, he was always the strongest one. Maria tells me stories about him. Emma continued, seeming not to notice the adult's emotional responses. She says he was funny and kind and that he would have loved Isabella very much. Marcus watched Maria's face soften as she listened to Emma speak about Tommy with such natural acceptance. He realized that his daughter had accomplished something in 5 minutes that he and Maria hadn't managed in an hour. She made Tommy a real person in the room rather than a source of conflict. When the Santos family finally left, it was with a tentative agreement to visit again, to find ways for Isabella to know her father's family without Maria having to sacrifice her autonomy. Margaret Santos had held Isabella for nearly an hour, singing traditional lullabies in Apache and telling her about her father. David had apologized to Maria for taking so long to stand up to their mother, admitting that grief had made him coward. That night, after Emma had gone to bed and Isabella was settled, Marcus found Maria on the porch again. But instead of the peaceful scene he'd grown accustomed to, he found her crying deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere profound. "Hey," he said softly, settling beside her and offering his handkerchief. "What's wrong?" "I was so scared," Maria said through her tears. "When I saw them coming up the road, I thought they were going to try to take her away from me. I thought I was going to lose her too." Marcus put his arm around her shoulders, feeling her tremble with the aftermath of fear and relief. "That's not going to happen. I won't let it happen. But you heard what Margaret said about me being an outsider, about not understanding their ways. What if she's right? What if I can't give Isabella everything she needs to know about her heritage?" "Maria," Marcus said firmly, turning to face her, "you are Isabella's mother. You love her, you're protecting her, you're raising her with kindness and strength. That's what matters. The rest, the cultural traditions, the family connections, you'll figure out how to include those as she grows." "How can you be so sure?" Marcus thought about his own experience with Emma, about all the ways he'd worried that he wasn't enough, wasn't giving her everything she needed. "Because I see how you are with her. I see how you are with Emma. You have more love and wisdom in your little finger than most people have in their whole bodies." Maria leaned into his embrace, and Marcus felt something settle into place between them. They'd weathered their first real crisis together, had stood as a united front against external threats. It felt like a foundation upon which something stronger could be built. "Thank you," Maria whispered, "for standing up for us, for protecting us." "You don't need to thank me," Marcus replied. "This is what families do for each other." The word hung in the air between them, laden with possibility and hope. Family. It was what they'd been building without naming it, what they'd been moving towards since that first day when Maria had trusted a stranger with her vulnerability. As they sat together under the vast canopy of desert stars, Marcus realized that healing sometimes came not from forgetting the past, but from finding the courage to embrace an unexpected future. And for the first time since Sarah's death, that future seemed not just possible, but bright with promise. The autumn months brought changes to the desert landscape that mirrored the transformation happening within the walls of the Thompson Ranch house. The cottonwoods turned golden, painting the creek bed in shades of amber that caught the light like scattered coins. The air grew crisp in the mornings, requiring sweaters and the first fires in the old stone fireplace that had sat cold since Sarah's passing. Isabella was growing with the startling speed of infants, her personality emerging more clearly each day. She had developed a fascination with Rusty, the old border collie who had appointed himself her guardian, lying patiently beside her blanket while she grabbed at his ears with increasingly coordinated hands. Her laugh had become a soundtrack to their days, bright peals of delight that rang through the house whenever Emma made funny faces or Marcus played peekaboo during feeding time. Maria had settled into the rhythm of ranch life with a naturalness that continued to surprise Marcus. She'd proven to have an intuitive understanding of animals, helping him with the horses when one of the Mares developed a persistent limp, and showing an unexpected aptitude for the countless small repairs that kept an old ranch functioning. Her hands, which created such delicate embroidery, were equally capable of mending fence wire or adjusting the settings on the old water pump. It was during a particularly busy week in late October that Marcus realized how completely Maria had woven herself into the fabric of their lives. Emma had come down with a stomach bug that kept her home from school for 3 days, and Isabella was teething, making her fussy and unpredictable. Marcus was dealing with a sick calf that required around-the-clock monitoring, and the combination of responsibilities would have overwhelmed him just months earlier. Instead, he found himself part of a smoothly functioning team. Maria took charge of nursing Emma back to health, making the kind of soft foods and gentle remedies that his daughter's sensitive stomach could handle. She managed Isabella's discomfort with the patience of someone who understood that some phases simply had to be endured, offering cold washcloths to chew on and singing the lullabies her own mother had sung to her. When Marcus returned from his late-night checks on the calf, he would find the house peaceful, both girls sleeping soundly, and Maria waiting with a warm meal and a listening ear for his concerns about the sick animal. "I don't know how you do it," Marcus told her one evening as they sat by the fire. Isabella finally settled after a difficult day. "A few months ago, one sick kid would have sent me into a panic. Now I feel like we can handle anything." "That's because we can," Maria said simply, looking up from the quilt square she was piecing together. "Two parents are always stronger than one." The casual reference to herself as a parent to Emma stopped Marcus short. It was true. Over the months, Maria had gradually taken on more of the maternal duties that he'd struggled with alone. She braided Emma's hair in the mornings, helped with homework in the afternoons, and tucked her in at night with stories that often featured princesses who looked remarkably like a certain blonde 8-year-old. Emma had begun going to Maria for comfort when she scraped her knee or had a bad dream, seeking the kind of gentle nurturing that Marcus loved to provide, but sometimes struggled to express in the ways his daughter needed. "Is that what you see yourself as?" Marcus asked carefully. "Emma's parent?" Maria set down her needlework and looked at him with those steady dark eyes that had first captured his attention. "I see myself as someone who loves her like my own daughter. If that makes me a parent, then yes." The honesty of her answer stirred something deep in Marcus's chest. Over the months, he'd watched Maria's relationship with Emma evolve from polite kindness to genuine affection to something that looked remarkably like maternal love. Emma responded to it hungrily, as if she'd been waiting for exactly this kind of gentle female guidance to help her navigate the complexities of growing up. "Emma's teacher called me in for a conference last week," Marcus said. "Mrs. Henderson wanted to know what we'd changed at home. Emma's been more confident in class, more willing to participate in group activities. Her grades have improved, and she's made several new friends. Children bloom when they feel secure," Maria said. "Emma knows she's loved and supported. That gives her the foundation to take risks and try new things." Marcus nodded, remembering his own childhood on this same ranch, the confidence that came from knowing his parents were solidly behind him whatever he chose to pursue. He wanted that same feeling for Emma, but had worried that his own grief and uncertainty had created too much instability in her young life. "You've given her that security," he said. "You've given it to both of us." The conversation was interrupted by Isabella's cry from the guest room. No longer the sharp wail of a newborn, but the more sophisticated complaint of a baby who had learned that crying brought the attention she wanted. Maria started to rise, but Marcus stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Let me," he said. "You've been with her most of the day." Isabella's face lit up when she saw him, her chubby arms reaching up with the kind of trust that never failed to move him. As he lifted her from her crib, Marcus realized that he'd come to love this child as completely as if she were his own. The fierce protectiveness he felt for Emma had gradually expanded to include Isabella, and the thought of either of them being hurt or taken away filled him with the same primal fear. When he returned to the living room, Isabella content in his arms, he found Maria watching him with an expression that made his pulse quicken. "What?" he asked, settling back into his chair with Isabella playing with the buttons on his shirt. "Just watching you with her," Maria said softly. "She loves you, you know. Really loves you. Not just because you're safe and familiar, but because you're hers." The word hit Marcus with unexpected force. His. This beautiful, bright-eyed baby girl who had come into his life as a complete stranger and somehow become essential to his happiness. "She's yours too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're her mother, and you're her father," Maria replied. "Not biologically, maybe, but in every way that matters." The acknowledgement hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither of them had quite been ready to voice until that moment. They had become a family, not the traditional nuclear family that Marcus had once imagined for himself, but something more complex and perhaps more beautiful. A family built on choice rather than blood, on love rather than obligation. "Maria," Marcus said carefully, "I need to tell you something. These past months, having you and Isabella here, it's changed everything for me." "You've changed everything for me." Maria set aside her needlework entirely, giving him her full attention. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I was just surviving before you came. Going through the motions, trying to be enough for Emma, but feeling like I was failing most of the time. Now I wake up excited about the day. I look forward to coming home. I feel like the man I used to be before grief took that away from me." "Marcus," Maria began, but He pressed on, needing to get the words out before his courage failed. "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "Maybe I've already fallen. I love the way you sing to Isabella in the mornings. I love how patient you are with Emma's endless questions. I love watching you work in the garden, and I love our talks on the porch after the girls are in bed. I love your strength and your gentleness and the way you make this house feel like a home again." Maria's eyes filled with tears, but Marcus couldn't read whether they were tears of joy or distress. The silence stretched between them until Isabella, perhaps sensing the tension, began to fuss. Marcus bounced her gently, waiting for Maria's response. "I love you too," Maria said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been falling in love with you since that second week, when you stood up to Margaret Santos. Maybe even before that, when you offered to help a stranger without asking what was in it for you." Relief flooded through Marcus, followed immediately by a surge of something that felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. "Then what happens now?" "I don't know," Maria admitted. "This isn't how I ever imagined my life would go. I thought I'd have the traditional path, marry young, raise children with their father, grow old in the same community where I was born. Instead, I'm here with you and Emma, and it feels more right than anything else ever has." "It feels right to me too," Marcus said. "Scary, but right." "What about Sarah?" Maria asked gently. "I don't want to replace her memory or make Emma feel like she has to choose between loving her mother and accepting me." Marcus considered the question seriously. It was something he'd wrestled with privately for weeks, wondering if his growing feelings for Maria constituted some kind of betrayal of the promises he'd made to Sarah. But gradually, he'd come to understand that love wasn't finite, that opening his heart again didn't diminish what he'd shared with his wife. "Sarah would want us to be happy," he said finally. "She would want Emma to have a mother figure, and she would want me to find love again." "I'm sure of that." "How can you be so sure?" Marcus smiled, remembering a conversation he'd had with Sarah during her final weeks in the hospital. She'd been worried about leaving him alone, about Emma growing up without a mother. He'd promised her that he would be enough for their daughter, but Sarah had shaken her head. "She'd told me that if something happened to her, she didn't want me to spend the rest of my life alone," Marcus said. "She made me promise that I would stay open to the possibility of loving again, that I wouldn't let grief turn me into a bitter old man who couldn't appreciate joy when it came along." "And you think this is what she meant?" "I think Sarah would have loved you," Marcus said with conviction. "She would have seen how good you are with Emma, how much you love Isabella, how hard you've worked to build something beautiful from the pieces of your broken life. She would have respected your strength." Maria was quiet for a long time, her gaze moving between Marcus and Isabella, who had fallen asleep in his arms with the boneless abandon of babies. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but emotional. "Tommy told me something similar. Toward the end," she said. "We knew the pregnancy was high risk, knew there was a chance something could go wrong. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would find love again. He said life was too short to spend it alone when there were people in the world capable of making me happy." "Smart man," Marcus said. "He was," Maria agreed. "And I think he would have liked you. You're both the kind of men who protect what they love." As if in response to their conversation, Emma appeared in the doorway of the living room, rubbing sleep from her eyes and clutching her favorite stuffed animal. She'd clearly been awakened by Isabella's earlier crying, but she moved toward them with the kind of purposefulness that suggested she'd been listening to at least part of their conversation. "Are you and Maria going to get married?" she asked with the directness that only children possessed. Marcus felt his face flush, but Maria reached out and drew Emma onto the couch beside her. "Would you like us to?" Maria asked gently. Emma considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think Mom would want me to have someone to braid my hair and teach me about girl stuff. And Isabella needs a daddy who knows about ranching and can teach her to ride horses." "Those are very practical considerations," Marcus said, trying not to smile at his daughter's matter-of-fact approach to family planning. "Also," Emma continued, "you two look at each other the way Mom and Dad did in the pictures. Like you think the other person is the best thing in the world." Marcus met Maria's eyes across the space between their chairs, seeing his own wonder reflected in her expression. Out of the mouths of babes, he thought, remembering another of Sarah's favorite sayings. "We haven't figured out all the details yet," Marcus told Emma. "But yes, I think we probably will get married." "How would you feel about that?" Emma seemed to consider this seriously. Would Maria still be Maria, or would she be Mom? What would you like her to be? Maria asked. Can she be both? Emma asked. Like Maria when we was talking, but Mom when I need mom things? I think that sounds perfect, Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. I would be honored to be your mom, Emma. And Isabella would be my sister? She already is your sister, Marcus said. In all the ways that count. Emma nodded, satisfied with these arrangements. Then, yes, I think you should get married. But I want to help plan the wedding. And I want to wear a fancy dress. Deal. Marcus laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. Later that night, after Emma had been tucked back into bed with promises that they would discuss wedding plans in more detail the next day, Marcus and Maria found themselves on the porch again. But this time, instead of sitting in separate chairs, Maria had moved to the porch swing where she could lean against Marcus's shoulder while Isabella slept in her arms. So this is really happening, Maria said, her voice filled with wonder. If you want it to be, Marcus replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I know it's fast and I know it's complicated. The best things usually are, Maria said. Fast and complicated, I mean. They swung gently in the cool night air, listening to the familiar sounds of the desert settling into darkness. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and closer by, the cattle moved restlessly in the pasture, their low sounds a comforting backdrop to the conversation. I have one condition, Maria said eventually. What's that? I want to be married here on the ranch, with just our families and a few close friends. Nothing fancy, just something real. Marcus smiled, imagining Maria in a simple white dress standing in front of the old stone fireplace, Emma beside her in whatever fancy dress she chose, Isabella gurgling happily in someone's arms. It would be small and intimate, exactly the kind of celebration that would honor both the life they'd built together and the new chapter they were beginning. I can't think of anywhere I'd rather marry you, he said. As the night deepened around them, Marcus reflected on the strange turns life could take. 6 months ago, he'd been a widower struggling to raise his daughter alone, convinced that the best parts of his life were behind him. Now he was planning a wedding to a woman who had arrived in his life as a stranger in distress and become a missing piece he hadn't known he was looking for. The desert had brought them together, and the desert would witness their vows. It seemed fitting, somehow, that this harsh but beautiful landscape that had taught him about endurance and survival would also be the setting for his second chance at love and happiness. Some stories, he thought, were worth the wait. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping across the high desert with an intensity that caught even the long-time ranchers off guard. The first snowfall came in November, blanketing the ranch in pristine white that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and strange. Emma pressed her face to the kitchen window each morning, marveling at the way the snow clung to the fence posts and gathered in the hollows between the rolling hills. For Maria, it was her first experience with a true desert winter, and she discovered both its harsh beauty and its practical challenges. The old ranch house, built for scorching summers rather than freezing winters, required constant attention to keep warm. The ancient furnace wheezed and coughed like an elderly relative, and Marcus found himself making daily trips to the basement to coax it back to life. It was during one of these frigid mornings in early December that their carefully constructed new life faced its first real test. Marcus was outside before dawn, breaking ice on the water troughs and checking on the cattle who huddled together for warmth in the shelter of the barn. Maria was inside with the girls, trying to get the coffee maker to work despite the kitchen faucet's tendency to freeze overnight, when she heard Isabella's breathing change. At first, it was just a small wheeze, barely noticeable beneath the baby's usual morning babbling. But as the hours passed, the wheeze became more pronounced, accompanied by a cough that sounded too harsh for someone so small. By the time Marcus returned from his morning chores, stamping snow off his boots and calling out cheerful greetings, Maria was sitting by the fireplace with Isabella in her arms, her face tight with worry. She's been coughing since about 7, Maria said without preamble. And listen to her breathing. Marcus immediately crossed to them, his own cheerful mood evaporating as he heard the labored sound of Isabella's respiration. The baby's usual bright demeanor had dimmed, and she lay listlessly against Maria's chest, her tiny face flushed with fever. How long has she been like this? Marcus asked, already reaching for his jacket. It started gradually, Maria said, her voice steady but strained. But it's getting worse. I think we need to take her to the doctor. The nearest hospital was 40 miles away in Alamogordo, a drive that usually took just under an hour, but could stretch much longer in winter weather. Marcus looked out the window at the snow that had begun falling again, thick flakes that promised to make the mountain roads treacherous. The truck's got four-wheel drive, he said, making the decision quickly. Emma, get your coat and boots. We're all going to town. The drive was a nightmare of sliding tires and white-knuckle navigation. Marcus gripped the steering wheel with both hands, fighting to keep the truck on the narrow road that wound through the foothills toward town. In the back seat, Maria held Isabella close, monitoring every breath while Emma sat beside them with a kind of silent seriousness that meant she understood this was an emergency. Halfway to town, Isabella's breathing became even more labored, and Maria's careful composure finally cracked. Marcus, she's getting worse. I can barely feel her breathing. Marcus pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the truck's limits on the icy road. We're almost there, sweetheart. Just hold on. The hospital in Alamogordo was small, but well-equipped, and the emergency room staff took one look at Isabella and whisked her away for immediate evaluation. Marcus, Maria, and Emma found themselves in the familiar purgatory of hospital waiting rooms, surrounded by the antiseptic smell and fluorescent lighting that made everything feel unreal. Bronchiolitis, the doctor explained when she finally emerged to speak with them. It's common in babies during cold season, but it can be serious, especially in children as young as Isabella. We're going to need to keep her for observation, probably for several days. Maria's face went white. Is she going to be okay? With proper treatment, most babies recover completely, the doctor assured her. But we need to monitor her oxygen levels and make sure her breathing doesn't deteriorate further. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of hospital rooms, uncomfortable chairs, and the constant background noise of medical equipment. Marcus arranged for a neighbor to tend the cattle and drove back and forth between the hospital and the ranch to collect necessities and check on the animals. Emma, with the resilience of childhood, adapted to sleeping in hospital chairs and eating cafeteria food, turning the frightening experience into an adventure by befriending the nurses and learning the names of all the medical equipment. Maria never left Isabella's side. She slept in the reclining chair beside the baby's crib, monitoring every breath and responding to every small sound. Marcus watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern, recognizing the fierce maternal devotion that wouldn't let her rest while her child was suffering. It was on the second night, during one of his brief trips home to tend the animals, that Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Margaret Santos arrived at his door just as he was preparing to return to the hospital, her usual stern expression softened by worry. I heard about Isabella, she said without preamble. How is she? Marcus was surprised by the genuine concern in her voice. In the months since their confrontational first meeting, Margaret had visited twice more, each time gradually warming to Maria and beginning to build a relationship with her granddaughter. But this was the first time she'd shown up uninvited, and the first time she'd seemed to view Marcus as something other than an obstacle to her family relationships. She's stable, Marcus said, inviting her inside out of the cold. The doctors think she'll be fine, but it's been scary. I want to see her, Margaret said. Is Maria there with her? She hasn't left the hospital since we got there, Marcus confirmed. I think she'd appreciate the support. Margaret nodded, then surprised him again by saying, I'll drive you back. The roads are bad, and you look exhausted. During the drive to the hospital, Margaret was unusually talkative, sharing stories about Tommy as a baby, about the illnesses and injuries that had terrified her as a young mother. The first time Tommy got really sick, I didn't sleep for 5 days, she said. I was convinced that if I stopped watching him, something terrible would happen. That's how Maria's been, Marcus said. I can barely get her to eat, let alone sleep. She's a good mother, Margaret said quietly. I was wrong about her, wrong about a lot of things. Grief made me cruel, made me blame her for Tommy's death when I should have been helping her through it. At the hospital, Margaret's arrival created a transformation in Maria that Marcus hadn't expected. The sight of Tommy's mother walking into Isabella's room, carrying flowers and a small stuffed animal, broke down barriers that had persisted for months. Maria began to cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears she'd been fighting for days, but deep, relieved sobs that seemed to come from the very center of her exhaustion and fear. She's going to be okay, Margaret said, settling into a chair beside Maria and taking her hand. She's strong, like her parents. She's going to be just fine. I was so scared, Maria whispered. I kept thinking about Tommy, about how suddenly everything can change. I couldn't bear the thought of losing her too. You're not going to lose her, Margaret said firmly. And you're not alone. You have Marcus, you have Emma, and you have me. Isabella has a whole family who loves her. The acknowledgement seemed to lift a weight from Maria's shoulders. For the first time since Isabella had gotten sick, she allowed Marcus to convince her to eat something substantial and take a short nap while Margaret maintained a vigil beside Isabella's crib. On the third day, Isabella's breathing finally began to improve. The harsh wheeze that had terrified them all gradually subsided, replaced by the normal, easy rhythm of healthy respiration. Her fever broke during the afternoon, and by evening she was alert enough to smile at Emma's silly faces and reach for the colorful mobile that the nurses had hung above her crib. She can go home tomorrow, the doctor announced during evening rounds. Keep her warm, watch for any return of symptoms, and follow up with your pediatrician in a week. That night, as they prepared to leave the hospital, Marcus found himself reflecting on how the crisis had changed things between them all. Emma had proven herself remarkably resilient, adapting to the disruption with a maturity that reminded him she was growing up faster than he sometimes realized. Maria had shown him depths of maternal strength that made him love her even more, while also revealing vulnerabilities that made him want to protect her from any further pain. Most surprisingly, Margaret Santos had evolved from antagonist to ally, her love for Isabella overriding her previous prejudices and creating the foundation for what Marcus hoped would be a lasting peace between the families. I've been thinking, Maria said as they drove home through the cleared roads, Isabella sleeping peacefully in her car's seat. About what Margaret said, about Isabella having a whole family. I want her to know both sides of her heritage, to understand where she comes from. That sounds like a good plan, Marcus agreed. What did you have in mind? I want to learn more about Apache traditions, about the stories and customs that Tommy would have wanted her to know. And I want to make peace with my own family, to give Isabella connections to my heritage as well. Are you ready for that? Marcus asked gently, knowing how painful Maria's estrangement from her family had been. I think so, Maria said. Having children changes your perspective on forgiveness, doesn't it? I want Isabella and Emma to grow up understanding that family is worth fighting for, worth the effort to heal old wounds. The conversation was interrupted by Emma's sleepy voice from the back seat. Are we still going to have the wedding? Marcus and Maria exchanged glances. In the crisis of Isabella's illness, their marriage plans had been pushed to the back of their minds, postponed indefinitely while they focused on more immediate concerns. Of course we are, Marcus said. Why would you think we wouldn't? Because maybe you decided you don't want to be married to someone whose baby gets sick, Emma said with the kind of logic that made perfect sense from a child perspective. Oh, sweetheart, Maria said, turning to look at Emma with eyes bright with tears. That's not how love works. When you love someone, you don't stop loving them because hard things happen. You love them more because you want to help them through the hard things. Is that why you stayed at the hospital with Isabella, even when you were really tired? Exactly, Maria said. And it's why your daddy drove back and forth every day to take care of the ranch and bring us food and clean clothes. Love means taking care of each other, especially when things are difficult. Emma seemed satisfied with this explanation. So, when are we going to have the wedding? Marcus laughed, feeling some of the tension of the past few days finally begin to ease. How about Christmas Eve? That gives us a few weeks to plan, and it would make Christmas extra special this year. Can I wear my red dress? Emma asked. The one with the sparkles? You can wear whatever makes you happy, Maria assured her. As they pulled into the familiar circle drive of the ranch, Marcus felt a profound sense of homecoming. The house looked smaller than he remembered, perhaps because he'd spent the last few days in the institutional vastness of the hospital, but it also looked more precious. This was where they belonged, where they'd built something beautiful together despite the challenges that life had thrown at them. Inside, Maria immediately set about making the house warm and welcoming for Isabella's return. She turned up the heat, checked that the nursery was properly warmed, and prepared a simple meal that would be easy on all their hospital-weary stomachs. Marcus watched her move through these familiar routines and realized that this was what he wanted to see every day for the rest of his life. Maria making their house into a home, caring for their children, building the kind of family that could weather any storm. That night, as they sat by the fire with Isabella contentedly nursing and Emma reading quietly nearby, Marcus brought up something that had been on his mind since the hospital vigil. "I want to adopt Isabella," he said quietly. "Legally, I mean. I want her to be officially mine, not just in our hearts, but on paper." Maria looked up from the baby with surprise, and then with something that looked like joy. "Really? You want to do that?" "She's already my daughter in every way that matters," Marcus said. "I love her. I'm committed to raising her, and I want her to have the security of knowing that can't change. If something happened to you, God forbid, I want there to be no question about my right to care for her." "What about Tommy's family? Would they object?" Marcus considered this. "I don't think so. Margaret's seen how much I love Isabella, and she knows that adoption wouldn't change Isabella's connection to her Apache heritage. If anything, it might give her peace of mind to know that Isabella will always have someone committed to protecting her interests." "And Emma? How would she feel about having an official sister?" "I think Emma would love the idea," Marcus said. "She's already treating Isabella like her sister. Making it legal would just confirm what's already true in her heart." Maria was quiet for a long time, looking down at Isabella, who had fallen asleep in her arms. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I would love that," she said. "I would love for Isabella to have you as her father in every possible way." "Then, we'll talk to a lawyer after the wedding," Marcus said. "We'll make it all official. The marriage, the adoption, the family we've built together." As the evening wound down and they prepared for bed, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that autumn day when he'd found Maria crying beneath the desert willow. What had begun as a simple act of kindness had evolved into something far more complex and meaningful, a love story that encompassed not just the two of them, but their children, their extended families, and the community they were building together. The challenges would continue, he knew. There would be more illnesses, more conflicts, more moments when the strength of their commitment would be tested. But tonight, sitting in his warm house with the woman he loved and the children who had become the center of his world, Marcus felt ready for whatever the future might bring. They had proven they could face crisis together, could support each other through fear and uncertainty, and could emerge stronger on the other side. Love, he realized, wasn't just about the easy moments, the romantic dinners, and quiet conversations under the stars. It was about showing up during the hospital vigils, about driving through snowstorms to get help for a sick child, about finding ways to bridge differences and build connections even when it seemed impossible. He and Maria had found that kind of love, the real kind, the lasting kind, the kind that could weather whatever storms the desert might send their way. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of crisp, clear weather that made the New Mexico high country look like a postcard. The snow from the previous weeks had settled into a perfect white blanket across the ranch, transforming the familiar landscape into something magical. Icicles hung from the eaves of the old ranch house like nature's own decorations, and the morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and silver that seemed too beautiful to be real. Marcus stood on the front porch at dawn, drinking his coffee and watching the cattle move slowly through the snow toward their morning feed. In a few hours, this same porch would be decorated with white ribbons and winter flowers, and he would stand here again to marry the woman who had transformed his life from survival into joy. The guest list was small, exactly what Maria had wanted. Margaret Santos would be there, along with David and several other members of Tommy's family who had gradually warmed to Maria and come to accept Marcus as part of Isabella's life. Emma's teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had asked to attend, having watched Emma bloom over the months and developed a fondness for the family. The local pastor, a kind man named Father Miguel who had known Marcus since childhood, would perform the ceremony. Most importantly, Maria's parents and younger brother were driving up from Phoenix, a reconciliation that had taken months of careful letters and phone calls to arrange. The healing between Maria and her family had begun during Isabella's hospital stay. Faced with the possibility of losing her granddaughter before they'd even met her, Maria's mother had called the hospital in tears, apologizing for years of stubborn pride and begging for a chance to be part of their lives again. The conversations that followed had been difficult, but necessary, full of tears and explanations and the slow work of rebuilding trust that had been damaged by cultural differences and family disagreements. They loved Tommy once they got to know him, Maria had explained to Marcus after one particularly long phone call with her mother. But they were afraid of losing me to his world, afraid that I'd forget where I came from. They didn't understand that loving someone from another culture doesn't mean abandoning your own. And now, they want to meet you, want to know the man who's been caring for their granddaughter. My mother's been crying happy tears for a week, talking about finally getting to hold Isabella and meet Emma. The morning of the wedding brought a flurry of activity that reminded Marcus why he generally preferred the straightforward work of ranching to the complexities of social events. Maria had been up since before sunrise, arranging flowers and supervising the setup of chairs in the living room, where they'd moved furniture to create a small chapel in front of the stone fireplace. Emma had appointed herself assistant wedding coordinator, checking and rechecking that everyone had the right flowers for their boutonnieres and helping Maria with last-minute adjustments to her dress. Isabella, now fully recovered from her bout with bronchiolitis, seemed to sense the excitement in the air. She babbled happily from her high chair, banging a wooden spoon against the tray and charming everyone who came within range of her infectious smile. Margaret Santos had arrived early to help with preparations and had immediately taken charge of keeping Isabella entertained while the adults handled the more complex logistics. "She's going to be a heartbreaker," Margaret said, lifting Isabella from her chair and dancing around the kitchen with her. "Look at those eyes. She's got Tommy's mischievous look and Maria's stubborn streak," Marcus added, dodging a playful swat from his bride-to-be. Maria looked radiant in a simple white dress she'd sewn herself, its clean lines and delicate beadwork reflecting her own aesthetic rather than following any particular fashion trend. She'd woven small white flowers into her dark hair, and the combination of traditional and contemporary elements seemed to perfectly capture who she was, a woman who honored her heritage while embracing new possibilities. Emma's red dress with sparkles had proven to be every bit as dramatic as she'd hoped. She'd spent the morning practicing her role as flower girl, solemnly scattering rose petals along the path from the kitchen to the living room and curtsying to an imaginary audience. "Do I look like a princess?" she asked Marcus as he adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror. "You look like yourself," Marcus said, "which is even better than a princess." Emma considered this seriously. "I think being myself is probably more fun than being a princess anyway. Princesses have to wear crowns all the time, and that sounds heavy." "Very practical thinking," Marcus agreed, grateful as always for his daughter's ability to find the humor in any situation. Maria's family arrived just as Father Miguel was setting up his ceremonial items on the makeshift altar they'd created on the mantelpiece. The reunion between Maria and her parents was emotional, but joyful, full of tears and apologies and the kind of fierce hugs that spoke of love that had survived years of separation. Maria's mother, Elena, was a smaller, older version.